Welcome everybody. My name is Professor George Wilson. I'm an assistant professor at Valdosta State University in the Langdale College of Business Administration there. And today I have a presentation on Sarbanes-Oxley. It's entitled Sarbanes-Oxley, What Have We Learned? And this is a literature review, and it's a more narrowly focused literature review versus some of the other ones that you will see. So let's just get going here. For those of you who don't have much knowledge about Sarbanes-Oxley, it was passed in 2002. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed in 2002. And it is in response to the outbreak of high-profile accounting scandals which occurred during that time period. To give you a little bit of context about that, in 2002, there were approximately 24 major accounting scandals in that year. And in the 20 years prior to that, from 1981 through 2001, there were 15. So there was a 50% increase in accounting scandals in a single year versus the prior 20 years. And of course, that will get the attention of regulators and government officials. And the response was the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And Sarbanes-Oxley has numerous provisions in it, but the gist of it is that it is designed to improve auditor independence. It's designed to bolster corporate governance, and it's designed to assure users of financial statements that there are adequate internal controls in place to produce reliable information. Some of the key aspects of Sarbanes-Oxley, probably the major aspect was the creation of the PCAOB. There was limits on the type of non-audit work that auditors could do. There's some required audit partner rotations in there, once again meant to bolster auditor independence. There's also some requirements about corporate governance in terms of the audit committee and the makeup of the board of governors and the sort of relationship between auditors and the audit committee, where management no longer hires or fires auditors, but instead that is it's done through an independent committee and the board of directors. And of course, the Section 404 requirements to assure proper internal controls. So it's a pretty broad-reaching act, and it has a lot of different provisions which touch a lot of different areas of business. And that brings me to the scope of this literature review. If you go look at prior literature reviews on Sarbanes-Oxley, they tend to be pretty broad. They cover a lot of material. They're very lengthy. They also tend to focus on the question of whether or not Sarbanes-Oxley has a net benefit or a net cost on business. This literature review is not designed to do that. The scope is much more narrow. This focuses on the relationship between Sarbanes-Oxley and earnings quality. So I'm looking at a very specific topic here. How did Sarbanes-Oxley affect earnings quality, specifically in the realm of earnings management, for accruals earnings management and real earnings management, in terms of restatements and other related factors? I've also divided this into the early period, which is the roughly 10 years following Sarbanes-Oxley, and the more recent period, which is 2013 up until the present. And there's a reason that I've made this division. I told you that prior studies we're trying to answer largely the question of whether there was a net benefit or a net cost. I do not try to do that in this study whatsoever. By narrowly focusing this and looking at these two time periods, the question that I am focusing on is, what was the impact of Sarbanes-Oxley on earnings quality, and is that impact stable and consistent through time? And by dividing it into two time periods, we're able to see whether the effects that Sarbanes-Oxley had early on, did those last through time, or did they somehow change as time went on? And that's what this is going to focus on. So if we go back and look in the early period of our earnings management studies, probably the best study to start out with is the Cohen, Day and Lease 2008 study. So what Cohen, Day and Lease finds in a typical pre-post environment is that following Sarbanes-Oxley, there is a decrease in the use of accruals to try to manage earnings, and there's an increase in real earnings management, which is those interventions into the actual operations of the business in order to try to boost reported earnings. That is also strengthened by Lobo and Zhao, and the paper by Chicharia and Greenstein in 2007. Those are very consistent with what you find in Cohen, Day, and Lease, where you find less accruals earnings management and more real earnings management. Lobo and Zal and Chicharia and Greenstein, they were looking at whether firms were using accrual earnings management or real earnings management to beat benchmarks following Sarbanes-Oxley. And they found that same decrease in accruals earnings and increase in real earnings management. You also had the paper by Ko, Matsumoto, and Rajgopal in 2008, and then the Bartov and Cohen 2009 paper. Once again, these early period studies between earnings management and Sarbanes-Oxley tend to all give us the same sort of evidence and the same sort of answer. These two papers find decrease in the earnings management to meet or beat the analyst forecast of earnings. So we have a series of papers here, all fairly high profile papers, and they're all giving us the same sort of answer, and that is a decrease in accruals earnings management and increase in real earnings management. Now, to some degree, if you want to talk about a net benefit versus net cost, you can naturally see why that might be a hard question to answer here, because a decrease in accruals earnings management, we would tend to say that is a positive thing. It bolsters earnings quality. But then you turn around and say there is an increase in real earnings management, and that has a very destructive nature to reported earnings and an actual real cost in terms of cash cost to business also. So you can see why you would get a very conflicting answer if you're trying to talk about net benefit versus net cost here in the early period. There's also a series of papers which looked at the incentives to manage earnings in this early period. So Zhang, Petroni, and Wang in 2010 had a very interesting paper where they found that prior to Sarbanes-Oxley, there was a positive relationship between the executive equity incentives and accruals, right? Which is probably a very normal thing that you would see in business. But what they found is after Sarbanes-Oxley, that relationship between accruals and executive equity incentives, not only did it fade away, but it actually reversed. There became a negative relationship between accruals and executive equity incentives. And that's backed up by Carter, Lynch, and Zekman in 2009. Right? They looked in the post-SOX period, and what they found is a stronger relationship between CEO cash compensation and reported earnings following Sarbanes-Oxley. So what this suggests to us is that there's an increased level of trust in reported earnings after Sarbanes-Oxley. And then the Daniel, Dennis, and Naveen paper in 2008 looked at the management of earnings around dividend payouts and found that there was a decrease in that. So all of these papers together, once again, are saying that what you're seeing after Sarbanes-Oxley tends to be an increase in the trust of reported earnings, that the incentives to manage earnings are weakened after Sarbanes-Oxley, and what that should naturally lead to is an increase in the actual the quality of reported earnings. And there's a series of papers which mainly came from around 2006 through 2011 looking at this very question right here. So if you look at the Iliev 2010 paper, that's probably a very good study to think about if you want to think about how Sarbanes-Oxley has impacted earnings quality. Because the Section 404 of Sarbanes-Oxley for the internal control reporting applies to firms which have a threshold of $75 million of value and above. Firms which are smaller than that are not required to report under Section 404. So what Iliev did is look at firms who are just above that $75 million threshold and firms which are just below that $75 million threshold. So firms which have to report under Sarbanes-Oxley Section 404 and firms that don't. And what he found is that those firms that are just above that exemption level, so that they do have to report, had significantly lower total accruals and significantly lower discretionary accruals than firms which were just below that exemption level. So that's pretty strong evidence that Sarbanes-Oxley is having an impact on the earnings management behavior, at least in terms of accruals and discretionary accruals, which leads naturally to higher earnings quality. Singer and you back this up in a different way. They looked at firms in the United States versus matched Canadian firms. So firms in the U.S. required to report under Sarbanes-Oxley, and Canadian firms which were at the time not required to report under any type of Sarbanes-Oxley-like regime. And they found results which are very similar to what Iliev had found before. Right, in that there was a lower level of intentional misstatements, and there was a higher predictive power of current earnings for future earnings and cash flows for our U.S. Sarbanes-Oxley subject firms. So once again, suggesting that we have higher quality of earnings under a Sarbanes-Oxley regime than under a regime which does not use Sarbanes-Oxley. Lobo and Zhao in the Ashball-Scaife et al. Paper tend to confirm this also, right? Lobo and Zhao finds that there was more timely loss recognitions after Sarbanes-Oxley, another measure of earnings quality. And Ashball and Scaife, they looked at just a broad measure of earnings qualities, and they found that earnings quality properties increased for firms who had to go through the remediation under Sarbanes-Oxley Section 404. Any firms who had a deficiency and then had to go through the remediation following that, there was an uptick in the measures of earnings quality for those firms. Altogether, once again, suggesting the same thing, and that is that Sarbanes-Oxley is having a positive effect on the quality of reported earnings. The last area that I tend to look at here is what happened with restatements around Sarbanes-Oxley. And just following Sarbanes-Oxley, there was just an explosion of restatements. And what Plumley and Yan find in their 2010 paper is that most firms attribute those restatements to unintentional errors operating under a new broad change like Sarbanes-Oxley. Just caused a lot of mistakes, which were not intentional in any way. And this is somewhat backed up by the papers that follow here, because what is found in the Hennis, Leon, and Miller paper, and then again in Burke's 2011, is that there's a milder negative reaction to restatements right after Sarbanes-Oxley, particularly those where the firms are citing unintentional errors. Burke's 2011, they found once again a lower negative reaction to restatements after Sarbanes-Oxley, even when you can control for the magnitude of the restatements. So overall, what we can say about restatements following Sarbanes-Oxley in those years just after Sarbanes-Oxley is there was a much higher number of restatements, but a lot of that was due to what firms described as unintentional errors, and the market seemed to react to those as though they were unintentional errors. So if you kind of recap all this early evidence put together, what you have is lower incidence of accruals-based earnings management, an increase in real earnings management where actual operations are coming into play. There appears to be an increase in the trust of reported earnings, an increase in earnings quality, and we had this big increase in restatements right afterwards. So to some degree, if you think about the purpose of Sarbanes-Oxley in terms of reported earnings, it appears in these early years that it is accomplishing its goal of higher quality reported earnings. Now, I divided this into two time periods, and the reason I did that, as I said, was to see whether these effects of Sarbanes-Oxley would be static across time or whether we're going to see changes across time. And there's some reason to believe that we might see changes across time. In the Wilson 2013 paper, which I wrote, I asked the question then whether the effects that we see from Sarbanes-Oxley are exclusively because of the actual institutional changes that Sarbanes-Oxley makes, or is it because there's simply a heightened sensitivity in the market in the years following Sarbanes-Oxley? So is this a temporary phenomena where market participants are more sensitive to the reasons why Sarbanes-Oxley was created in the first place, right? To malfeasance or high levels of earnings management, or even the fraudulent activities that we saw prior to Sarbanes-Oxley. Is that a sensitivity of market participants that would then fade over time, or are we seeing changes from Sarbanes-Oxley that were due to the actual institutional structural changes that Sarbanes-Oxley is making, which then, of course, we would see continuing over time? And what I would tell you is, if you take all this evidence, all these papers together, it's a mixed bag. So Wilson 2013 looks at that same time period of pre-post Sarbanes-Oxley and finds that same increase in real earnings management that was seen in prior papers, but there did not appear to be the same decrease in accruals earnings management, which seemed like a fairly odd result at the time. Well, there's a working paper right now in 2020 by Pincus, Wu, and Wang, which does that very same thing again, looking at the pre-post Sarbanes-Oxley time period and trying to replicate what was done in Cohen, Day, and Lease. And they find the same result as Wilson 2013, and that is there's a clear increase in real earnings management, but the decreases in accrual earnings management is spotty in certain sub-periods of time after Sarbanes-Oxley. It appears to go down. In other sub-periods of time, it does not appear to change. So it's not an open and shut case that accruals earnings management decreased following Sarbanes-Oxley. It's still very much an open question. And then there's another series of papers which follow here, which offer more evidence on this. So if you look at the Gertzman, Lott, and Liu paper of 2018, what they found is that new CEOs try to avoid the downward earnings management following Sarbanes-Oxley. So if a CEO was new into the company, you didn't see the accruals earnings management trying to manage earnings downward, which was there prior to Sarbanes-Oxley. However, when they looked at CEOs who were on their way out and under performance pressure, they increased their use of both accruals earnings management and real earnings management to boost reported earnings following Sarbanes-Oxley. So once again, it's that same idea that it's not as open and shut of a case as there's lower accruals earnings management and there's increased real earnings management. It's very sensitive to the exact circumstances that we're looking at. And what we're seeing in this later period of earnings management studies around Sarbanes-Oxley is a more nuanced view of what's going on. The Kama and Melamod paper, which is a very interesting new study which has been published, they find that firms increase their management of accruals cash conversions post Sarbanes-Oxley. So the idea here is some of those papers right after Sarbanes-Oxley found this lowering of accruals earnings management. And what Kama and Melamod say is what was really going on during that time is firms started to manage that accruals cash conversion. And by doing that, they were actually camouflaging what was going on with their accruals earnings management. It was making it more difficult to perceive accruals earnings management for external parties, because in fact they were doing something else simultaneously with that accruals cash conversion. So what they are suggesting here, what their evidence is suggesting, is that the accruals earnings management never really declined post Sarbanes-Oxley. It just became more difficult to measure. A few other papers here, the Kazir et al. Paper in 2015 found that Sarbanes-Oxley had no significant effect on the use of income tax reserves to manage earnings. And the Lee 2019 paper, they found that real earnings management has negative effects on earnings, right? And that, of course, the use of real earnings management has increased post Sarbanes-Oxley. So once again, if you look at these papers and you kind of take them together and you say, what are they trying to tell us here? What they're trying to say is it's not such a closed question as to the effect of Sarbanes-Oxley on earnings management. The early papers almost exclusively said there was an increase in real earnings management and a decrease in accruals earnings management. The papers that come in more recent years, which look at this in some different ways, provide more inconsistency and say this is more of a mixed bag. It is not an open and shut case here. There's some other papers which are in this list, and I'll let you read those in the manuscript as to what they add in. They all tend to support that same mixed idea of the effect of Sarbanes-Oxley on earnings management. When we look at papers which are focusing more on Sarbanes-Oxley and earnings quality, we get a few different papers here which have some interesting things to say. The Courteau, Cow, and Tian paper in 2015, they find that what they find is that prior to Sarbanes-Oxley, if you were to use residual income valuation models for firms versus discounted cash flow models, for firms which appeared to have high discretionary accruals, that the residual income valuation models did not work as well as those discounted cash flow models, which makes sense because those accruals were introducing noise into the residual income valuation models. But they found that post SOX, that gap between residual income and discounted cash flow models pretty much closed to zero, so that the effect of accruals earnings management of high accruals was mediated post Sarbanes-Oxley. And the Ditelou, Francis, and Willikins 2016 paper, which is very similar to the Singer and Yu paper, which was listed earlier in the early time period. They looked at Belgian firms, subsidiaries in Belgium, which were owned by U.S. companies versus those which were not. So basically looking at, once again, subsidiaries which were subject to Sarbanes-Oxley versus those which were not. And what they found was that the subsidiaries which were subject to Sarbanes-Oxley by virtue of being owned by U.S. corporations, that they had smaller accruals and they had more timely loss recognitions than those not subject to Sarbanes-Oxley. So very consistent with the prior period, and once again suggesting higher earnings quality. And the Kedia, Cohen, Rajgopal 2015 paper, they found that firms were less likely post Sarbanes-Oxley to adopt poor accounting practices from their industry peers. Prior to Sarbanes-Oxley, what you would often see is that if firms in an industry began using some type of accounting practice which was advantageous to them, but would also be seen as a poor accounting practice, possibly weakening earnings quality, that would often be adopted throughout the industry fairly rapidly. But post Sarbanes-Oxley, that did not occur. So when we look at the idea of earnings quality, even in the most recent period, it tends to line up with the prior period also, and that is we continue to see a march towards higher earnings quality. The restatements that have occurred here, the research on restatements in the most recent period is much more limited than what you saw in the prior period. And the reason for that I'm going to attribute to the fact that there is a significant decline in restatements in more recent years. Right after Sarbanes-Oxley, we saw a big uptick in restatements that seems to have declined away as time has gone on. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the restatement studies here in recent years, except to say that they have largely declined, and most of the literature dealing with restatements is now focused more on audit research as opposed to the financial accounting and reported earnings research. So in conclusion, we can say without a doubt that Sarbanes-Oxley, even after 20 years, continues to be a topic of great interest. The accounting literature keeps producing numerous papers on the subject. We can also conclude that the research question about the permanence of Sarbanes-Oxley's effects remains open, is very much open for research. It's a ripe area for research. These effects from Sarbanes-Oxley, in some areas, it looks like they're persistent and static, but in other areas, particularly around the use of earnings management, do not appear to be static. So there is plenty of area still yet to be researched. So with that, let me leave you with my contact information. If you want to get in touch with me to discuss anything about this literature review, I'd be happy to speak with you about it. Contact information is listed here. My email address is listed here. And I thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you about this paper.